gratitude. We thank you for your gifts to this church and to our causes. And we especially are thankful for the gift that is Renee. When we meet somebody new, we notice and mentally register their attributes, or some of them, categories in our consciousness that they fit into. And we assume these help us to know and understand something about who this person is and what we expect from them. Some attributes like gender, race and ethnicity, height, weight, attractiveness, these are usually pretty easy to observe and classify. Others, like religion, place of birth, sexual preference, wealth, and intelligence, might require deeper scrutiny. But we all classify and assume. We need to. And eventually, as we get to know the person for real, we sometimes are surprised to learn how wrong we were. But until we get to know someone better, we use the clues we gather to help us form our first impressions. This information, of course, consists of stereotypes that we assign to the observed traits. Stereotypes that, and I quote here, so permeate society that they are not contested. Just as everyone knows that the earth goes around the sun, so everyone knows that gays are promiscuous, Indians are alcoholics, and that women are good with children. White males, on the other hand, insofar as they escape group marking, can be individuals. Now, these words might have hit your ear funny. They were written by an academic about 35 years ago, Iris Marion Young. And I find it interesting and quite encouraging how much the details change with our cultural sensibilities. Few would now assume that all LGBTQ plus persons are promiscuous, or that most Native Americans are drunks. But the types are still familiar, and much to the chagrin of many people I know, and many in this room, it's probably still assumed that all women are good with children. What is still is mostly truthful in this quote is that I, as a heterosexual adult white male, remain untouched by most of the important negative stereotypes, and therefore I am freer to define myself and to take control of my own narrative, at least more than many other persons. And even this is changing. Many of you might see me and say, there goes a misogynist. We know that stereotypes are oversimplified, often unfair, and sometimes very dangerous. And this is particularly true when they have direct and tangible influence on our lives in ways that have no relation to what is just or fair. We choose to prefer persons in certain categories over others, and we consciously assign them more power and more influence than other persons. And when I say we, I don't mean each of us all the time. I mean we categorically, society. For example, overall, males are more dominant than females. Whites over African Americans, Native Americans, and Asians. Heterosexuals over homosexuals. Able of body or mind persons over those without abilities. Ethnic Europeans over Hispanics, and adults over the youth and elderly. I'm not saying these people are better or anything else. I'm just saying they carry a basis for granting or denying certain privilege. And unlike education, wealth, intelligence, and ability, all of these are ascribed statuses. They're fixed. They're traits that a person did nothing to obtain, but that just are. When some groups benefit from a privileged status for no good reason, what about the others? These groups and the people that occupy them tend to be systematically and unfairly oppressed to the extent they lack the associated privilege. My wife called me recently. She was livid because a bank computer had flagged a purchase she made as questionable and froze the card she used, which is tied to a debit account that's our joint account. Now, being denied was an inconvenience, but it's not what challenged her sense of justice. What did was the fact that the bank was unwilling to let her fix it without consulting me first, the man on the joint account. And I pity the soul that told her that. But this happens repeatedly. Does it sound familiar to any women in the room? Well, I'm getting off track here. In contemporary American society, the most widespread and persistent inequalities are those based on race. This is an identifiably American problem. White privilege is not a political argument or a position. It's a measurable reality that is manifest in many aspects of our daily life. A few examples. Other things being equal, a white American is less likely to be detained, arrested, convicted, or sentenced, severely at least, for a crime. A white person is more likely to receive a home or business loan, can purchase a car at a lower price, can use credit cards without extensive documentation, can walk through a store and be presumed to be a customer and not a thief, can live in a community that provides access to stores and resources, can survive a confrontation with law enforcement, will receive a job interview, can choose whether or not they are concerned about race, participate in a group without having to represent for their race. And this is just a sampling. Note that white privilege extends into so many areas of life simultaneously that it operates everywhere. And the resulting oppression is not the product of any one activity, but results from a barrage of simultaneous and persistent conditions. Most privileges listed here do not rely on malevolent intent or hateful discrimination. They are insidious precisely because they reflect people living life and making choices in ways that feel normal, correct to them. And of all the categories of privilege, only race is based on a factor that is a social construct and a biological fiction. It took hundreds of years of history and the invention and reinvention of discriminatory institutions to mold the racial imbalances we know today. We created race as the most salient category defining persons in America. Our enslavement and breeding of captive Africans in the South, followed by economic subjugation, Jim Crow segregation, urban ghettoization, and mass incarceration, these created our racial history. We, and I'll say we a lot, referring to white people today, and I apologize to the people in the room who this doesn't apply to, but I am speaking of a white cultural phenomenon. We became whites only by inventing blackness as a contrast and by devaluing blackness continually with laws, with economic discrimination and cultural inventions. And as a white person, I need to come to terms with this legacy that members of my race created. And it's complex. I carry white privilege. I am treated differently than African Americans, that I am presumed to be safer in most ways. This privilege is pretty much invisible to me. I presume that I can walk down most streets or into businesses, and if my presence is challenged, I would consider it a huge injustice and an affront. Yet I learn that I'm advantaged only when I'm told that other persons have different experiences and different fears than I do. We first see white privilege as it affects individuals. We can see how the absence of privilege, which I will call oppression, interrupts the process and progress of African American persons on a daily basis, sometimes placing them at competitive disadvantage, sometimes putting them at risk of harm. Here's one example that I like. The beloved, our good friend, Mr. Rogers from Kids TV, liked to explain to his youthful audience, when I was a boy and I would see scary things in the news, my mother would say to me, look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping. And he would go on to point out that uniforms are the easiest way to identify helpers, that policemen and firemen and others could always be trusted to provide help. He told this story as a way of assuring kids that they were safe and had agency when they found themselves in trouble. It was calming and it was nice. In contrast, though, Ta-Nehisi Coates, in his book Between the World and Me, along with so many other African American parents, tells his son of a different reality, a reality so often imparted that it's known as the talk. Each time a police officer engages us, death, injury, maiming is possible. Black life is cheap. Be careful. Find the helpers is very different from be wary of the police. Another view of privilege, another example of the cost of oppression. As events that reflect privilege accumulate, they build social patterns and institutions. Today, when we talk about white supremacists, we usually think of persons aligned with the radical right fringe, the Klan, other neo-fascist groups, white nationalists, most of Donald Trump's base. But when we consider how our social order perpetuates race and discrimination with the consequence of sustained oppression, we must acknowledge that white supremacy is the fact that underlies all of American life. Our American society is a white supremacy culture, rooted in our history, manifested in continuing inequality, discrimination, and privilege relations. It's not that all whites are motivated to act as oppressors, most are not, but that unequal life chances are the product of the continued practice of life as we know it. If we do not recognize and consider the system of oppression that we have built over the years, we cannot even start to consider dismantling racism and discrimination. Michelle Alexander, in her book, The New Jim Crow, did a marvelous job of showing how the excessive mass incarceration of African Americans in the last few decades was able to operate with very little overt racism or malfeasance on the part of any party involved, whether it be law enforcement, the defense attorneys, the prosecutions, or the judges. Yet business as usual was somehow structured in a way that created huge racial injustice in the outcome of all phases of the justice process. With supremacy and oppression, the dominant group just sort of presumes that their own culture and experiences are the societal norm, and that everyone should think and behave like them. Without going into detail, I will describe some primary values or expectations that may help us understand what is going on with the white supremacy culture discussion. Trying to come to terms with the consequences of sustained racism, many people turn to what until then had been a fairly obscure article written in 1990 by Tima Okun. This listed a set of 15 characteristics claimed to be cultural expectations that people from other groups had identified as dominant in American culture, especially in our workplace. The 15 behaviors are interconnected and mutually reinforcement. And I'll quickly run through some or all of them. Perfectionism, a sense of urgency, defensiveness and denial, valuing quantity over quality, worship of the written word, a belief that there is one right way, paternalism, either or thinking, power hoarding, fear of open conflict, individualism, progress defined as being more of anything, the right to profit, objectivity, and the right to feel comfortable. Now, that's a long list, and it's clear that they sort of all do pull together, but these virtues, they're not inherently bad, but we tend to be unaware that they are choices and that they are not universal truths. Winners make the rules, and even when they are unaware that they are the rules. The best way for an outsider to succeed in our social world is to assimilate, to adopt the value system held by the majority in power. And assimilation requires conforming, changing, and rejecting elements that may have existed in one's own culture. These are intended to demonstrate how much our expectations of others and our standards for evaluation of others are based on ideals and traits from our European heritage and culture that were aptly described by Max Weber in his book, The Protestant Ethic in the Spirit of Capitalism. For way too many people, Tima Okun's list, though, became definitional and was used as a checklist to define all things wrong and racist, especially in organizational practice. It was frequently misapplied, such as by workers claiming that any employer who demanded written reports or used performance measures was innately discriminatory and racist. And worse, it was weaponized by way too many as a way of hunting for white supremacy, leading to finger pointing and accusation. Both white and black executives have been accused of implementing white supremacist practice within their organizations. Several things about this list. First, although the name might sound exotic, Tima Okun, which sounds to me something like Ilhan Omar or some name like that, she's really just a middle-aged white woman who does organizational consulting and training. Second, the list was created as a reflective tool for use in an organizational training activity. Now, Okun is unabashedly liberal and detests the capitalist class, but as far as I know, she is not a card-carrying UU. The intention, she wrote, is to help us understand the water in which we are all swimming so that we can collaboratively work together to build and sustain cultures that help us thrive as communities and as individuals. We should want cultures that are not based on abuse of power and accumulation of profit. Cultures that embody the belief that we all do better when we all do better. Unfortunately, Okun's list became far more than she intended. It became synonymous with the concept and even the definition of what is white supremacy culture. A similar and far more nuanced construct is critical race theory, which asserts that race as a social construct is not merely the product of individual bias or prejudice, but something embedded in the legal systems and in policy. This is sort of the legal institutional side of the same discussion that frames the idea of white supremacy culture. But whatever tools we use for describing inequality and how our social structure operates against the interests of a large group of our citizens, they will be subject to disdain by conservative voices. Wokeism has become a slur, and all it does is refer to remaining alert and thoughtful about the political order. It's mocked incessantly as our critical race theory, diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, and other thoughtful ideas intended for supporting repair and restoration around race issues. Too often, these important thoughts are summarily dismissed and now in some states are illegal. I agree that looking at race alone is simplistic. Of all the attributes I mentioned, all of them come into play as well, and each can be a basis of oppression. The term intersectionality was created by an African-American legal scholar, Kimberly Crenshaw, to describe the combinations of multiple oppressions at one time. For example, African-American lesbians or Native American youth can have a multiplier effect on how the people are affected. And the underlying realities are really complicated. A person can belong to the privileged category in one set and be unprivileged in another. A working class white man might be truly annoyed when he's told that his whiteness and maleness somehow give him access to privilege. From his point of view, as a member of the working class, he might feel so pushed around and looked down on that the last thing he feels is privilege. But the truth is more complicated than whether he is privileged, because privilege is not really about him or you or me. It's about what happens to groups. Many of us believe that we are just pawns in a high-stakes game, and that the only true beneficiaries of the white supremacy culture are the white elites, the top of the capitalist class, the 1% of persons with extraordinary power and wealth, much hereditary wealth, persons with sufficient influence to form and make and enforce the rules. The ultimate purpose of white supremacy, so says Alex Capitan, is not to benefit all white people, but rather to keep power and resources consolidated and to keep them accumulating among elites with long-standing monopoly on control. This means that white supremacy negatively affects the vast majority of white people, albeit to a lesser degree than it affects people of color. Patriarchy and classism are indeed deeply intertwined here. Many folks don't like the term white supremacy culture, but I'm at a loss really to understand what's going on in any other way. It is the cultural component that sustains structural racism, the understandings through which we perpetuate inequality. But because of the too close association with Okun's list, I am looking for a new term, or maybe to reuse an older one like structural racism or systematic racism. And this is too bad, because I really feel that white supremacy culture is an idea that's right on point. For all of its value, though, Okun's tool is too simplistic and too rigid. It's just a listing of essential traits. There's no analysis, no history. Yet the insidious aspect of white supremacy culture is its near invisibility and its pervasiveness. Indeed, it took a systematic trail of horrible interactions between African Americans and our justice system to bring this idea into popular focus. This included things like drivers being stopped for driving while black, the creation of the school-to-prison pipeline, and far too many horrible episodes of lethal violence by police directed towards African American detainees. It took such high-profile injustices as the killing of George Floyd and the litany of all the other say-their-names people to wake most of us to the idea that this is an ongoing state of affairs. And it's important that we do be woke, whether Ron DeSantis likes it or not. Returning to each of us and to life here in Beverly, where does all this lead? Where does it leave us? I do agree that our society is built on a framework of white supremacy. Sometimes this is overt discrimination. Sometimes it appears through unintended and subconscious behavior. There is much that each of us can do to address this situation, yet probably nothing we can do that will immediately solve the big problems. But the work must be started. I'm an optimist about the long-term future. I still believe that, as Theodore Parker said in 1840 and Martin Luther King restated in 1960, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. You just have to be really patient to see that curve sometimes. For most of my lifetime, America has witnessed major progress in racial justice and human rights, and great improvement in the overall well-being of African American citizenry. The recent resurgence of hate-based narratives, however, and the racist imagery in our open political debate shows us that the work is far from done. What can I do as a white person? What can we all do to engage racism and racial inequality in ourselves, our communities, and our country? We can and should begin by each of us doing our own due diligence and soul searching about our relationship to racial issues and to African American persons and others who differ from ourselves. And we need to be honest. If you think you are not racist, and most of us prefer to think of ourselves as not racist, I suggest you think harder. We each have emotions and biases that are prompted by race. And instead of denying them all, we should actively engage them and become aware of where they come from, how they worked into our consciousness, and whether they are indeed useful or not. It's also important to engage and to get in proximity to persons of color. This is Brian Stevenson, the author of Just Mercy. This is his great piece of wisdom. Your job is to learn what you can and to offer yourself genuinely. No African American owes you an explanation of their story or should be expected to represent for their race. But you can't decide how to approach race issues without hearing African American voices and learning about their concerns. And as you do this, always check your motives. For all the terrible things done by my race, I should not embrace guilt, nor act out of feelings of guilt. I should only hold guilt for my own shortcomings and my own errors, not those of my progenitors. What I do have is a sense of a responsibility to help clean up their mess, if possible. So once again, deal with your feelings first. White guilt is a personal problem, not a good motive for engaging in system reform. Conservative legislatures are quickly promulgating laws to control how we teach history, whether race is an acceptable topic in schools, and to exclude all DEI programs in the public sector. The ostensible reason is that they don't want our kids to be made uncomfortable or ashamed. I vacillate between thinking that this manifests great insight because they themselves are recognizing that they are deeply ashamed by their attitudes, or whether it represents just a complete lack of imagination. While much of our racial history and our present is shameful, it can be fairly addressed without shaming the person hearing about it. It's only the suppression of such discussion that should bring shame. Be humble. We should offer ourselves as allies to the cause, but we can't sashay in and decide we know what is needed and how it should be done. As allies, we offer ourselves to work in coalition, and our first and second job is to listen and learn. Your own goals and your own ego are secondary to the cause. Be a brave ally. Be outspoken about your view of racial issues and the status quo. Challenge overt racism when you see it. Question racialized statements and assumptions, and challenge jokes, microaggressions, and other, quote, innocent things that help sustain the distance and the narrative of superiority. If you let these things pass, you are complicit. It may be uncomfortable, but it is right and it is necessary. And be ready to screw up. Cross-cultural learning and dialogue are fraught with places to make mistakes. This kind of engagement is messy, and mistakes are inevitable. When you do step in it, just own your mistakes. Avoid getting defensive, and don't try to explain them away. Be clear if you are confused, and ask for guidance. Hear what is being communicated. Now, most of these statements apply to almost any sensitive or challenging communication, but engaging in cultural boundary crossing work is a particularly likely place for these problems to arise. I believe that as Unitarian Universalists, we are morally bound to address what we see as wrong. I view the tangle of race, poverty, inequality, and injustice is the defining moral issue in today's America. We have trampled on the worth and value of persons and limited the potential of entire peoples. Live the words of Ella Baker, "We who believe in freedom will not rest until it comes." I am a white man in a society that has exploited others, particularly African Americans. And this affords me comfort and privilege. Yet I wear my whiteness with pride because that is what I am. I wear my whiteness with purpose because injustice gives me a cause. I wear my whiteness with a sense of responsibility and mission because what has been done is done, and we can now start the work of seeing it undone. It matters in today's America that I am white. My earnest hope is that someday, maybe, my children's children's children will not need to care. And so may it be. Amen. I bet we're singing. Please rise if you would